بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا وقدوتنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. This class is on the fiqh, understanding of Allah's names and attributes. Last class we began talking about general principles for understanding Allah's names and attributes, and we learned around half of them. So the first principle that we learned was that all of Allah's names are good and perfect. That means that His names represent qualities and characteristics that are the pinnacle of those qualities, right? So if we imagine that there's a quality that exists out there, such as goodness, such as generosity, such as mercy, such as power, that Allah's characteristics are the absolute pinnacle expression of these characteristics. They're not halfway, they're not mediocre, they're not deficient in any way. And we'll come a little bit more to explain that aspect of it in today's lesson, inshallah. The second principle that we learned was that all of Allah's names indicate or represent different qualities of perfection, right? So all of the names that Allah has given Himself or that has communicated to the Prophet ﷺ to teach to us, they all represent individual qualities, and those individual qualities are different from one another, even though, this is the next principle, even though that the same entity is being represented. So you have multiple qualities represented by multiple names, and all of that is pointing back and referencing one entity. And we talked about how we account for idolatry and how we account for polytheism is this kind of breaking up of the multitude of qualities that our Creator has into separate entities. So historically, you go and you take, for example, Allah's quality of creating and make that its own deity. And, for example, Allah's quality of being the most merciful and make that a separate entity, and make Allah's quality of being the most powerful and make that a separate entity. And this is how idolatry began. So we have an opposite teleology, and teleology means that we're accounting for human history here, than secular anthropology. Secular anthropology tells us that human beings, we evolved from apes, and we began by worshiping multiple idols and, all this kind of complicated polytheism. And then as mankind evolved, they also evolved their religion. The reading between the lines, the subtext here is that it's man-made as well, and that concepts, because to secular anthropology, religion or spirituality is concept and not truth, evolved or reformed or refined until it became monotheism. And so that's the more prevalent religion that we see today due to its late appearance and its somewhat sophistication or somehow conceptual superiority over other systems of belief, right? That's the secular anthropological outlook. Islam's teleology is the opposite. We say, no, Allah created human beings from Adam, and He granted him revelation. And those human beings at first in the beginning were upon pure monotheism, believing in God, worshiping God, and not worshiping anything else. Historically later, elements of polytheism, elements of idolatry crept into their monotheism and polluted it. Whether this idolatry was in the form of separating the different qualities of our Creator into many sub-deities, or whether it was elevating the status of a righteous human being such as Jesus, such as other people who could have been messengers, and raising them to a status where they share in the entity of God himself. And so this is how the Islamic framework accounts for the existence of idolatry and polytheism. We also learn that Allah's names are not eligible for reasoning, in the sense that we do not derive Allah's names and attributes from our own reason, that Allah is the one who described them and named himself to us, and that door is shut, simply because of the fact that our brains, which traditionally many Islamic scholars, now everybody, modern science, puts as the location of thought. Our brains are a created thing. They have a corporeal existence. They have mass. And because they are real and they are physical and they have mass, they have limitations. We'll talk more about this as well today in today's lesson, inshallah. So because of our limitations, we can't extend our imaginations or our reason to account for Allah's existence in its entirety. We can't extrapolate from our own kind of observations or rational principles and arrive by ourselves to know who is God. We are dependent in this particular field upon revelation, which Allah has given us in the Quran and the Sunnah to both describe himself and name himself. We talked also about how Allah's names are specific to him, either in kind or degree, right? So there are some names that the meaning of which absolutely no creature shares with him at all, such as the creator, al-Khaliq, that this aspect of actual creation, this characteristic, is something that is particular to Allah. No creature shares in this characteristic, let alone this name. Not only that, all creatures are defined by sharing the opposite characteristic, which is that they are created, and they do not create in and of themselves. They might birth, they might sire, they might be able to rearrange particles and substances and atoms to make things, but we do that from what already exists. When it comes to creating things in the first instance from nothingness, then this is the provision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. And we talked about, however, so that's the first category. The second category are there some characteristics that Allah has where he does share in those qualities, or we should say that he doesn't share, but the creation can be described with those qualities as well. However, there is a difference of degree. So we find that there are people who are merciful. We find that mercy exists in the creation. But we can never compare the mercy of Allah to the mercy of creation. The difference between them is incalculably high in terms of degree. And we'll, inshallah, talk more about that as well. We left off with a question. So we have these kinds of two different categories of Allah's qualities or characteristics, some that are not shared with any of the creation at all. You can't say that something in the creation is also a creator. No. And then some that do share in something of the quality, but not in the same degree. These sorts of, there are creatures that are merciful, there are creatures that are generous, there are creatures that have power. However, that power and that generosity and those qualities are all qualified, and they are conditional, and they are temporary. Things we'll also address later. They are not of the same degree or type of Allah's. We talked about naming human beings after Allah's names and whether it was permissible or not. And according to these two categories, our author, Sheikh Abdul Razak al-Badr, said that the first category, it's absolutely not permissible. You can't name anyone Rahman or Ar-Rahman, because this is a characteristic that is particular to Allah. Nobody else, no other creature has anything like it. However, other characteristics, such as generous, such as Al-Aziz, right? These sorts of things, Al-Jabbar, even Al-Malik, the king, or the possessor, we could say. All of these sorts of names, our author says that it is permissible to name someone after. And he points to the Quran in the story of Yusuf, where the woman's husband's title is Al-Aziz, and Allah mentions that in the Quran, and he doesn't correct it in any sort of way. However, I was asked, is there sort of consensus on this issue? And so I got to digging and researching, and I found a very, very interesting and rewarding mas'ala, or issue, and that there is no consensus in this issue. There are people who are of the opinion that any of Allah's names in any way, shape, or form are not permissible for you to name a child after, except if it has the prefix of servant of attached to it, Abdul Aziz, and that's well known. Other scholars said you can put the prefix of servant of Abd before it, or you can leave off the alif lam, which signifies the, right, the definite article. So instead of saying Al-Aziz, you can name someone Aziz, for example, but not Al-Aziz. And then there was a third group of scholars, and the author of our book is among them, who says that if the quality that the name represents is something that exists amongst the creation, then even then it's permissible, especially the ones that the Quran specifically affirmed, to name it even with alif lam, the definite article, Al-Aziz. However, all of them agree that what's preferable is that you don't even go close to that. And Nawawi says this in his Al-Majmu', his famous book of fiqh, that when it comes to naming people after the names of Allah, the best thing to do is not even go near it, unless, of course, you're going to attach the prefix of servant of, Abdullah, Abdul Rahman, and so forth. So today we have, and inshallah we're going to finish and complete the general principles dealing with all of Allah's names. So the next principle we have is that Allah's names and attributes are specific to Him in a way that befits His majesty. What this means, because this befits His majesty, is something that has been translated from a particular formula in the Arabic language, and it may sound foreign and unfamiliar to us in the English idiom as to what it represents. But what it's talking about is the ability, or better, our inability to access something of the reality of Allah's names and attributes and reality. Basically, we would say the how, right? We know that Allah is Al-Alim. He knows everything. He is omniscient. Do we know how Allah knows? No, we do not. This is something that the scholars from Imam Ahmed and before him, they talked about a lot, because you find that you'll run into issues if you try to think very hard about the how. How? We know that Allah sees everything and that Allah hears everything. How does He hear? How does He see? Quickly we will find that the only examples that we can bring to mind, or that we can imagine, rely on drawing an analogy between what we know from creation to Allah. So we know that we require eyes to see, and those eyes are made up of different components, and they interpret light, so they're dependent upon light, and all these sorts of physical, mechanistic explanations for how we see. So we get into trouble when we wonder, how does Allah see? Because our experience is limited to the creation. And we are unable fundamentally to think outside of that box of the creation that our experience is penned in or fenced in by. So because of that, we are unable to account for how. That's not what we're able to grasp. As we mentioned just a little bit ago, we have to remember that the human mind and the intellect, even though it is a powerful tool and it's a great gift that Allah has given us, it, like any other organ or any other faculty or any other muscle, in our body has limitations. Now, there are some limitations that differ from person to person, and there are some limitations that differ from species to species, and there are some limitations that there is no created thing on earth that can meet them. An example, we could imagine a weightlifter. You say, can you bench press 200 pounds? You'll find that among people, there are people who can bench press 200 pounds, and there are other people who can't. Then if you ask the question, okay, can you bench press 1,000 pounds? You can't find a single human being that can bench press that much weight. If you raise it to another order of 10, you say, can anything in this creation bench press 10,000 pounds? Then we would probably say, no, there's nothing in this creation that can bench press that much weight. So similar is our sight. We have eyesight. I have glasses. My eyesight's not very good. There might be people in my family that have 20/20 vision, or even better than that. However, the eagle or the hawk has even better vision than a human can ever have. But even then, there's still a degree of vision and sight that no created being can have. And so, similarly, our brains. There are things that our brains can understand, our intellect can grasp. There are things that some of us can grasp and others of us can't grasp. And then there are things that absolutely no creature in this existence, in this universe, can grasp. And the reality or the nature or the how, the modality, let's say, of Allah's attributes is one of these things. Allah has created our brains are a creation, and so they struggle at those limits and they can't surpass them to access exactly how does Allah see, exactly how does Allah hear, exactly how does Allah know. And every single group historically of Muslims who have tried to wrestle with these issues and go past their limits and try to understand things that are not understandable, they have ended up in trouble. This is exactly, we were talking in the first or second lesson about the Mu'tazila, the group, kind of the hyper-rationalists, and this is exactly the source of their strange opinions. Because when they thought about these characteristics and these names of Allah, such as sight, and they thought about how could Allah have sight, and that the only way to have sight that we know of from our experience in the creation is from things that have vision, eyes, lights, all these sorts of mechanistic, materialistic processes. And so they said, if Allah has sight and we have sight, then that means that Allah must depend upon light or eyes or these sorts of things to see, and that's not possible. So that Allah's sight means something that's entirely mysterious to us. We can't imagine what it is. And so they went to an extreme because they made this mistake in trying to wrestle or grapple with the how, the modality, the nature of Allah's names and attributes. So if we were to pose a question, and I kind of answered it earlier on, but we'll pose it anyway. If I say, or if you had to explain to somebody, let's say your child, let's say somebody, a coworker, and they came to you and said, okay, let me get this straight. You believe that your God, Allah, He sees. And me, I'm a human being, I see as well. What's the difference between my sight and Allah's sight? How would you respond to that question? Humans have limitations. Very good. Allah doesn't. Excellent. We can go even more specific, Sheikh family, to give 3 specific limitations that elucidate or illustrate the picture even further. So the first thing that we can say is that all of Allah's characteristics don't have a beginning. There was never a time where He didn't have them. Whereas humans, any created thing, we have a beginning. And so there was a period of time before where we didn't have those characteristics. Before I was born, I didn't see. Even when I first came out of the womb, I couldn't see very well. And there might come a day where I'm an old man where I can't see any longer. And certainly when I die, then my sight will have been removed. So that's the first and the second. Allah's characteristics do not have a beginning. They're not limited by time in the first instance when they began. And the second, the corollary of the first, is that they also don't have an end. If Allah is forgiving and merciful from the beginning of creation or the beginning of time and before, then He is always and always going to be forgiving and merciful for eternity. The third difference or the third limitation is for that brief period that human beings or any creature has any characteristic that shares a name or is in the same category as Allah's characteristics, ours are limited by deficiency and incompleteness. I see, but I can only see what's in front of me. I can't see what's behind me unless I'm on a webcam. I know, but I can only know things that come to me through certain means and channels, what I read about, what I hear about. I have sort of channels of information, and I can't really know anything outside of that. I can hear, but my hearing is very limited to certain frequencies, whether I'm awake or asleep, whether I'm a young man or an old man who doesn't know where his hearing aid is. Right? So all of these three are huge differences. As for Allah, all of His characteristics and qualities, they have no beginning and they have no end. And when Allah is having them, if you will, they are perfect. There's no deficiency to them. Allah has always seen, Allah will always see, and Allah's sight, nothing escapes from it. Allah has always known, Allah will always know, and nothing escapes Allah's knowledge. The next principle we have is that Allah's names are not limited to 99 or a specific number. And many people have this misconception, because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that certainly Allah has 99 names. Whoever recounts them will enter paradise. And so in kind of popular practice, a lot of people assume that that means that Allah only has 99 names. If we go to the Sunnah and we go even to the dua, the supplications, the prayers of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find that there are many things to indicate that there are more names than that. For example, one time the Prophet ﷺ was making dua, he was making supplication, and he called upon Allah by all of His names, and then he said, all the names that I know and that I don't know. Or he actually used a specific phrase which means the names that you've revealed to us and the names that you've kept with yourself, that you haven't revealed. And there are many other hadith that corroborate this evidence. And Nawawi, in his Al-Majmu', he claims consensus on this issue, that Allah has more than, not only has more than 99 names, but His names have no limit to them. Now, we could say, how do we understand that saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that certainly Allah has 99 names? Well, we have to finish the hadith. Certainly Allah has 99 names that if you recount them, you will be in paradise. And so the scholars explain this hadith by saying there's 99 specific ones that their memorization and their understanding and their application and their use in your worship will lead you to paradise. If you do all those things, if you interact and you utilize those names, these specific 99. The next principle is that, and this is the last one, is that Yes, Sheikh Family has a nice addition. He says it makes sense that Allah doesn't have limits in general, so he wouldn't have limits on his names either. That's a good point. The next and final principle is that Allah's names are not all equal. Some of them are better than others. And we know this because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he referred to something called al-ism al-a'zam, or ism al-a'zam, the best name of Allah, in some of the hadith and in some of his own devotional supplications. Now, there's a huge disagreement between the classical scholars as to which name of Allah is this best name. Some say it is Allah. Some say it is Al-Hayy Al-Qayyum, the everlasting, the self-sufficient. Some say it is Ar-Rabb, the sustainer. Some say it is Ar-Rahman, the most merciful. But we know that Allah's names have different values. Some of them are better than others, and some of them are more general than others. And we'll get to this in a second as we talk about the categorization or ways of categorizing Allah's names. Some of them are very general. They encompass multiple aspects of his reality. And some of them are very, very specific, and so they're more limited in their application or importance. So those cover all of the principles. What remains is talking about understanding kind of a bird's eye view of Allah's names in a categorical sense. We can think about Allah's names through certain categories that help us also. The categories, they're not meant to make things hard. They're meant to get us thinking about the reality of Allah and the reality or different aspects of the reality of his names. So one way of categorizing Allah's names, we can categorize one group of them into essential attributes. In Arabic, sifa dhatiyya, something that is so essential to Allah's existence that it is inseparable from it. It's something that can't be removed. It's always present, such as Allah's quality of knowing and seeing and hearing. The corresponding other category would be kind of an action quality or a quality of activity, something that Allah does. Now, in this case, Allah has the capacity to do this thing at any time. The capacity to speak, for example, is always present with Allah. So the capacity to speak is an essential attribute. However, that Allah speaks, it's something that only happens when and if Allah wills. Allah doesn't necessarily always have to be speaking. He does it or he doesn't do it according to his will. Understanding these two categories will help you navigate a doubt or a challenge that I encountered when I was a teenager that I'm going to pose to you now. Because if you have a child in public school or uses the internet in an unsupervised fashion, I'm sure that they've come across this question and this doubt. Atheists will pose the question, is it possible for God or for Allah to create a rock that's so heavy that he can't lift it himself? And I want to hear your answer. Your coworker, your son, somebody else comes to you with this question. What would you say to them? No, that's it? If you only say no, Sheikh Family, then he's going to say that implies that Allah is not able, good, that Allah is not able to create whatever he wants. And so it seems like it's a deficiency in your God. Allah can create anything, and he has nothing that can impede him. That's all true. But could he create a rock that was so heavy that he couldn't? Yeah, that's a good copy. That's a good thing. Please talk further with our Imam. That's why I'm here. So yes, sure, okay, easy answer. If you get this question, yes, call me up. You guys should have my number, and I'll talk to the person, yes. But there's really an easy way out of this, okay? This question is a trick question because it lies in the ambiguity. It lies in the ambiguity between an essential attribute and an attribute of action, okay? If we ask the question slightly differently, the answer becomes clear. Let's ask the question, can Allah forget? Can Allah oppress? Can Allah make a mistake? The answer to all those questions is no. Why is the answer to all those questions no? We'd say because it's a violation of who Allah is, right? You're essentially asking, can Allah be other than Allah? Of course, which the obvious answer to that would be no. Anybody comes up to you and says, can you be other than you? You say, no, are you stupid? And if someone asks that question in that way about Allah, can Allah be other than Allah? The question is no. And this isn't a deficiency. It's not a deficiency to not be able to be something else. It's especially not a deficiency or a defect to not be able to be weak or defective. But the question is dressed up in a way to hide the fact that that's what they're really asking. They're really asking, can Allah be weak, or can Allah be defective or deficient? In other words, can Allah be other than Allah? And so the answer is, Allah is able to do everything. His strength is perfect, and he cannot be other than he is. Just as Allah cannot forget, Allah could not create such a rock because such a thing could not exist. And that's not a deficiency in Allah's activity or ability. It's just a consequence of the reality of who he is. This is why Christians get in trouble with these questions. And I was a Christian and I was faced with this question and I'd never had an answer. Because well, should we go there? Time's running short. Because I'll just say this. If Christianity accepted this logic that this is a limitation not of ability but of identity, then they would not be able to accept that Jesus is God himself. Because the reason why Jesus can't be God himself is not an inability of Allah's ability. It's not a deficiency in Allah's ability or a weakness of his power. No, it's an inability, or better yet, an impossibility because of who Allah is. Allah is eternal, and so he can't be limited to time. Allah is self-sufficient, so he can't be on earth needing to eat and needing to sleep because he gets tired, right? So these things, they extend their consequences of his identity and not weaknesses or inabilities or imperfections. Yes, exactly. Okay, so we talked about that. There's also, we could say, a third category, attributes of Allah that have to do with disavowal or acquitting or distancing Allah from weakness, right? Al-Quddus, As-Salam. These sort of they're almost like negative characteristics in the sense that they free Allah from imperfection, right? And then a fourth category we could imagine are something like comprehensive attributes. They're attributes or qualities that refer to not one quality, but a group of qualities. Like Allah is Hamid, and He's Majid, He's majestic, and He's praiseworthy. Why is He praiseworthy? Why is He majestic? Because it touches all these other qualities. Because Allah is praiseworthy because He knows everything, because He's the most subtle, because He's the most forgiving, because He's the most powerful, right? Why is Allah the most majestic? Because of His power and His dominion and His all of these sorts of things, His ability to create. So that's one type of categorization. We could also imagine another type of categorization of Allah's names into qualities that are transitive, meaning that they have a direct effect on an object, and qualities that are intransitive, meaning they kind of exist in and of themselves without any relationship to any other created being. Examples of Allah's transitive qualities, for example, Allah is merciful. It logically necessitates that there be someone on the other end of that mercy who's receiving the mercy. Allah is all-hearing and all-seeing. Well, what is Allah hearing and what is Allah seeing? These are things that necessitate objects. Then there are ones that are true in and of themselves that don't involve any other part of the creation, such as Allah being the everlasting. Whether there was a creation or not, Allah will always be the everlasting. That Allah is the singular and the unique. These things they don't require a creation to exist in order to be relevant and true. So that covers the second half of, or not the second half, excuse me, the second part of this course. The first part was the introduction, including the introduction to the author. The second part was these general principles and categories about Allah's names. And the third, which we will start next week, inshallah, are going through, and this is the bulk of the course, the bulk of the book, going into Allah's specific names one by one, the ones that we're aware of, and talking about the meaning of them, how we should understand them, how we can apply them in our lives, what are the consequences of these names and the relevance to us in our worship and devotion. Does anyone have any questions before we conclude the class? No questions. Okay. Well, I know that the other participant here is my family, so I'll get their questions later. Thank you, everybody, for your time and your attention and interaction. And may Allah bless us with beneficial knowledge. And we will see you next time, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.